This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. On this episode, we will be talking about all things bass, or double bass, or contrabass, or whatever you tend to call it. The bass is just a little different from the rest of the string family, and not quite as straightforward as the violin, viola, and cello. It's an instrument that ed reps tend to encounter quite a bit, with frequent trips to and from the repair shop, and it's a commonly owned school instrument that teachers will look to you for advice on when it's time to make a purchase. We're fortunate to have one of the authorities on all things bass with us today, Jason Heath. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Shane. Always a pleasure.
So I wanted to go into kind of what your background is, maybe your musical background and what you do for Eastman, and why you're podcasting. What's your podcast about?
You bet. And I'll try to be brief. When you podcast, you tend to get used to going on and on about things. So I'll give you the short-ish version. I've been podcasting for a weirdly long time. I've been doing it since 2007. So
that's early.
Yeah. And my audio is a lot better now than it was in 2007. It kind of sounds like I was recording in the 20s at that point. But I had got a couple performance degrees in double bass in the Chicago area, Northwestern, and freelance for a bunch of years. And decided, really, my wife decided to go back to school to be a doctor, and I realized I probably need something a little more stable. So I ended up going back and getting certified and teaching high school orchestra for a bunch of years in the Chicago suburbs, and got to know a lot of ed reps around there, which is very cool. People near and dear to my heart, and then my wife matched for her radiology residency in San Francisco, and so we took a vacation in February to San Francisco. I think there was a foot of snow on the ground in Chicago, and I got a sunburn when I was visiting San Francisco, and we said that could work. So we moved out here, and I had been buying Eastman instruments as an orchestra director for years. I loved them, and it was just one of those coincidences. I wanted to go to the NAMM show in Anaheim, California, and one of the people for our school music dealer actually connected me with Saul at Eastman, and they got me a pass, and Saul and I started talking, and one thing led to another, and started working with Eastman and really enjoyed it and did more and more, and now I'm in this new and expanded role. And I never in a million years thought I'd be working for the company whose instruments I was buying back when I was an orchestra teacher, but it's kind of a neat path.
Yeah, certainly. We're lucky to have you. I love talking to you about string instruments. You're so passionate about it. And I can tell that you're used to talking about string instruments. And so I have to ask you, what's your podcast about?
Sure. It's called Contrabass Conversations, and that's a very talk bass was already taken. so I made a much longer name, and it's one of those things. I got really into podcasting when the iPod video came out, I think, or something like that, and I thought, boy, I wish there was a bass podcast, and started poking around. There was nothing really that I could find, and so I started, and I had no idea what I was doing, and I would ask to interview someone. They'd say, "Who are you? What's a podcast and why should I be on it?" And just through the course of events and people making introductions, I started to get some bigger guests, and that just sort of gained its own momentum. And so I'm coming up on episode 800 at this point, and it's just part of my week. I like to tell people that I could just lie and say I had a podcast, and I would get a lot out of it anyway, because it's a fun opportunity to sit down and carve out 45 minutes or an hour with someone who I'd want to talk to anyway. And so I get a lot out of it, and the fact that I can put it out in the world is kind of a side benefit.
So Jason, basses don't seem to follow the same rules as the rest of the string family. And one of the most obvious things is the body shape itself. You don't see the same exact shape on every bass. It looks like it changes from one bass model to the next. And I was hoping you could fill us in on what's changing there.
For sure. So welcome to the confusing world that is the double bass. And even the term double bass is confusing. There are like 25 different names for this instrument: contrabass, bass, bass fiddle, bass violin, and the list goes on and on. And like the names, the shapes of the basses are all over the map. So if you compare it to the other stringed instruments, which there are a little bit of variety, it's not, the bass is so much beyond that. And I won't go on and on about the history, but the history of the bass, it's kind of comes from a different family of the instruments. It's descended a little more from the gamba family. Okay. So it's tuned in perfect fourths from the bottom, E, A, D, G. So it's like a guitar, and it's exactly like a bass guitar in terms of the tuning. And so basses, because they come from the gamba family, a lot of the time you'll see what's called a gamba shape. And that is that sort of classic bass shape that doesn't have the little corners that poke out like the violin or the cello.
Okay.
It's one of the most common bass shapes. So if you just see, and it, instead of kind of poking out a little bit on all the sides, just like the violin, viola, and cello, that shape, that sort of sleek shape, that is a gamba shape. And there's no exact tendency for any one shape to sound different from another shape. There's some folklore about, a gamba is going to have a deeper tone than this other shape. None of that's really exactly true, or it can't really be scientifically measured. How the bass feels to the player and how it looks, those things do have an impact. So gamba is one of the classic bass shapes. You see it a lot in Germany and that part of the world, but it's common here as well, for sure. The other major shapes you see, and Eastman makes basses in all these shapes, by the way. The other major one you see is violin corner, which is just what it sounds like. So it looks like a violin, but it doesn't look exactly like a violin. You'll still notice the upper part of the instrument, the upper bouts, are going to be much smaller on a bass than they are on a viola or cello or violin. And there's just a practical reason for that. If you made the bass as big up top, the upper bout, as the lower bout, no human could ever play that bass. It's just you're kind of stretching the abilities of the adult human body to play this instrument. When you're down in the first position, like the most basic position, that is about as open as a person's hand can get. So we're just trying to make this instrument work for people. We're trying to get the biggest sound cavity, the biggest resonating body that will fit the greatest number of people. And I think that's a big reason why we have all these different shapes. So just real quickly, the other common shape that you are going to see and that we also make is what's called a quinoa shape. And again, like everything in the bass world, people have different ways of even pronouncing that word. It looks like quinol. It's Quenoil. I believe it's pronounced quinoa, but that's the way I pronounce it anyway. But that shape it's like a violin shape that has just been slimmed down. It's a little bit narrower. It is a model you see more frequently in France. It's a model that is very accessible for players trying to get up into the upper register. And so that shape, if people play a little more solo music, that can be great. If they're maybe not the largest person, that can also be helpful for getting around the bass too. So those are the three major shapes. We also have made for years a bussetto pattern, rather, which we're phasing out. It basically looks like a gamba with a little bit of fanciness down at the bottom. And then there are a bunch of other shapes that we're working. We have some exciting announcements coming soon in terms of some new bass shapes. Okay. So that's a very long way of saying basses come in all sorts of different patterns.
Okay. And you were an orchestra teacher in the Chicago area, and I'm curious, what would you have wanted in bass body style when you were an orchestra teacher?
Well, I like violin corners. I think they look cool. And there's a practical reason for violin corners, which is that if you've been playing a gig and you get a little sweaty or something like that, those gamba corners can be very slick. And I have almost dropped the bass, and not in a good way, by picking up my own bass. And I have 100% seen students drop the bass. So that is a practical reason for violin corners. There's also a practical reason against against violin corners, especially if your students are clumsy, which I had some of those, and that those corners are really easy to sort of chip off if they walk into a doorway or they catch it on something. Now you can always glue them back and get them fixed, and that's just something I've noticed practically speaking. So me, I like violin corners, but I had a lot of gamba basses, and for me, it's how does the bass sound, and is this bass going to work for a lot of the students that I have?
So one thing I also want to talk about is sizing of basses. It's a little funny. Whereas a full-size bass really isn't always considered a full-size bass.
Right. Again, we're in the world of confusion that is the bass. So the bass, there is really no such thing as a full-size bass, although just about everything in the bass world people debate. So people will say, yes, there is, but I challenge people to find a bass for sale that says 4/4. So what people generally play on is a 3/4 size bass. So that is what we generally think of as a full-size bass. Why don't we just call it a full-size bass? Well, that's just one of those musical, conundrums that we're stuck with. So your average full-size bass is going to be labeled a 3/4 size bass. But there's also what's called a 7/8 size bass. Well, what is that? It's basically a big 3/4 size bass. And that, just calling something a 3/4 size bass or a 7/8 size bass, that does not necessarily correlate to a specific number of inches in any dimension. Even in terms of the length of the string that you play on, basses can go from as short as 38 inches or even less to 46 inches in string length. And they could all be on a bass that you would call 3/4 or 7/8 or maybe even 5/8 or something like that. So there's a lot of non-standardization in terms of what those numbers even mean. But just for the sake of simplicity, there is a half-size bass, there is a quarter-size bass. They're all smaller basses like that. But as soon as you get to 3/4 size and 7/8, you're going to see things in all shapes and sizes. So 3/4 just kind of means full-size bass, and 7/8 means big full-size bass.
Okay. So if a teacher asks for a full-size bass, they're probably asking for a 3/4 or 7/8.
Yeah,
most, right?
they're almost always asking for a 3/4 size bass. If they ask for a full-size bass, that's almost 100% going to mean 3/4. If they ask for a 7/8 size bass, that means that they've probably done some research, so they actually do want a 7/8 size bass. But full size should be, for the most part, interchangeable in most people's minds with full size, and 3/4 should be interchangeable, more or less.
Okay. Thank you. That topic can be really confusing for a lot of people.
Yes.
So let's talk about what the body of the bass is made of, because it's not always the same materials, right?
Right. It is, in most cases, when we get to a professional level, it's going to be maple back, maple sides, and spruce top. And in all stringed instruments, but particularly in the bass world, there is a lot of experimentation in terms of tone woods. So on basses, you will see poplar, you will see willow. Now, you're still going to see that spruce top, but I'm talking about the back and the sides. Part of the reason for that experimentation is because it takes so much wood to make a bass. And if that wood has any sort of imperfection, can't use it for the bass. So we're talking about the fully carved basses just for a second here. Those generally, just like violin, violoncello, you're going to see spruce top, maple back and sides. But then in the bass world, you're going to see a bit more experimentation with some other woods. Now, bass players will use what's called either a laminate bass or what's called a hybrid bass. And you will see both of those used in professional situations much more frequently than you would see violin, viola, or cello. I don't know if I've ever played a gig with a violinist playing a fully laminate violin. But bass players, there are a lot of, particularly in the jazz world, when you're plucking and you have an amp and all that sort of stuff, there are a lot of people that go their entire career playing on a fully laminated bass. So
no kidding.
that's and then and again, the bass world is so non-standardized. There's rockabilly and all these other styles. They actually want a laminate bass, and they stand on the bass and they paint them up with flames. And Eastman does not make those basses, but you'll see that too. So folks, don't stand on your basses, but it is something that you see from time to time. Now, something you see even more frequently are these hybrid basses. If you put a spruce top on and keep the back back and sides laminate, you've got a pretty good sounding instrument. And that is what is our VB95. That is an instrument, laminate sides, laminate back, spruce top. Now, the most impactful thing in the instrument in terms of resonance and tone quality is the top. So if you get that spruce top on there, you're getting some great sound. There's a very practical reason also for this kind of instrument. You'll see a lot of jazz players play this kind of instrument because they're going into clubs, they're banging into cymbal stands, they're taking a lot of abuse. And so you're still getting that tone quality from the top, but you've just got a sturdier construction. Think about your average orchestra room or band room. That can be a pretty good instrument, particularly if you're talking jazz band, something that's not necessarily, you want it to play well and sound good, but you also want it to be sturdy. That's a great option. And then we have maybe my favorite option out of the hybrid basses that we make. We have the 105, which is a carved back maple, a carved top, spruce, and laminate ribs. Now that's a great combination, and especially if you are living in, I don't know, Minnesota, upstate New York, pick your cold winter place of choice, those basses, because there's just so much wood on the bass varies depending on humidity and temperature so much. I mean, we're talking noticeable raising and lowering of the strings and all that sort of thing, and having a bit of a sturdier construction, having those ribs that are laminate really makes for a stable bass. And that 105, you've got that great resonant top. You also have the back, so you have even more resonant material on the bass, but you've got some of that sturdy construction. So you find both that the fully laminated, but also some sort of hybrid used in professional situations much more frequently than you might expect.
What about in the school setting? Is there a recommendation for, say, junior high versus high school as to what body construction you would recommend?
If you can, I would always try to at least get a carved top because the difference is so surprising. Now, if we're talking about the smaller sizes, those are going to be laminate. You know, if we're talking about the quarter size and the half size, and you're frequently finding quarter size and half size, particularly half size at the middle school level. But every school, just about every year when I was an orchestra teacher, I would get a call from the middle school saying, "Oh, can we get a 3/4 size? We have a student that's almost 6 foot." And so frequently you do need at least one 3/4 size bass. We make a nice fully laminated bass, but that top, just getting that spruce top makes such a difference. So my general recommendation is I really am a fan of the 305, or certainly above, but the 305 for orchestral programs once you get to the high school level in particular, because now you've got everything carved. It's a nice resonant instrument. If you are in a challenging climate, or you have a orchestra room or band room where you just know it's spotty in terms of keeping the heat on or keeping the AC on and that sort of thing, having either laminate ribs or perhaps even laminate ribs and back is going to be a little bit of a safeguard. But it's hard to compete with those 305 and above once we're getting into the carved woods. But if stability is an issue, it's definitely a good idea to consider some sort of hybrid.
Good advice. So another thing on bass that is a little different when you look at this instrument versus violin, viola, and cello is oftentimes you see on the bridge, you have these wheel-looking things. What are they?
Yes, we can call them wheels or bridge adjusters is a common term. And the reason we have those is they enable us to raise and lower the bridge. Now, you might look, and someone, especially an upper string player, might look, a violinist, violist, or cellist might look and think, isn't that going to affect your tone? Because you're essentially chopping the bridge in half and putting these wheels in there. Well, there have been a lot of studies done on tone and having bridge adjusters, and it does not have much or perhaps any of an impact on the sound. Maybe a little bit of an impact, but it's negligible based on the research I've done. What it does is it allows you to bring the height of your bridge up or down. And that is really important with bass, just because bass is huge. If you look at a violin and you look at a bass, they're both going to be affected by weather, but because there's more wood, that just the variability is so much greater on the bass. So you will come in and it's November and you're in the Northeast or the Midwest or something, and you notice that the strings have become so low that they're almost touching the fingerboard. And that's because the whole instrument has shrunk. It's gotten colder and it's gotten drier, and that wood just pulls in. And so you don't have bridge adjusters. Well, now you've either got to have another bridge, which that's annoying. And then also, what if it goes up a little bit the next day and the strings are now a little bit higher? There's just a lot of variability even within the same season for bass. So those bridge adjusters let you just bring the bridge up a little bit, down a little bit, that kind of thing.
Okay, so for someone who's never done it, how do those what's kind of the step-by-step process to actually raise and lower the bridge?
Yeah, you're not going to probably cause any harm doing this, so don't be too scared. You just have to sort of figure out which direction brings the bridge up, and it's really hard to describe or even demonstrate on the instrument. You will know when you try it, but just make sure. Unlike if we're talking about electric guitar or bass guitar, unlike that, you want to make sure that you raise or lower them the same amount because they're not independent. If you just raise one side, what you're actually doing is shifting all the strings over a bit to one side, and that's going to affect your setup. Now, your strings are coming down in a different place on the fingerboard. Your bow is going to intersect with the string in a slightly different way. You could get some rattling or buzzing, or it might just feel bad or even sound bad. So whatever you do the same amount on each side. And what the luthier that works on my bass did, which is a cool idea, he just took a little bit of white out and he put a little dot on the top of each bridge adjuster. And I can just look at that dot and make sure that I turn it the same amount.
Easy. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So another thing that's kind of unique to bass is that I'd love to wrap my mind around are the bows and the fact that there are two different styles of bows. What's that all about?
Right. Well, it's another non-standardized thing with the bass, and the fact that the bass comes from this gamba family of instruments. You will see the bow that looks like the violin, viola, and cello bows, which is the French bow. Though, if you actually hold it up to a violin bow, you'll notice that the bass French bow is way shorter than the violin bow. And actually, if you hold up all the bows, you'll probably notice that the lower the instrument, the shorter the bow. And that is because the string, you just don't need to move the bow as fast as you go down in instruments. And then there's a practical reason for bass, which is your arm is only so long. You can't have that long a bow. It doesn't really work. So French bow is the one that looks like the other bows. It has the same exact frog, that piece of ebony where it's held. Now the German bow is the one that has this really big, wide open space, and that is held what we would call underhanded. It's like if you're going to shake somebody's hand, the bow just goes right in there, so the thumb kind of sits on top of the stick. French bow looks just like violin, viola, and cello. The thing to keep in mind with that is that, so a lot of people in the upper string world or violin, viola, cello world kind of get scared of the German bow, and so they end up recommending the French bow. The bows are way more similar than you might think. It's really just whether it's held overhand or underhand. Everything from the wrist on up to the shoulder and everything works the same. You're going to find about a 50-50 split in terms of who uses French bow and who uses German bow. But what you're really going to find is that if your students are taking private lessons, or if one of your feeder programs, if you're a high school director, they just have a lot of German bows or a lot of French bows, or their teachers used to starting them on that, you're likely to find a whole bunch of people playing one or the other too. You might go to one high school and everybody's playing German bow. It's just because the local teacher starts everybody on German bow. Or you might find French bow, or you might have two people that have a whole bunch of each. So it's a good idea to stock both, just because you're going to find both. And you might find one school where it's just 100% French bow, 100% German bow. So it all depends. But they look more different than they are, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's not right or wrong. It's just preference.
It's absolutely not right or wrong. If you want to ruffle some bass players' feathers, tell them they need to switch bows, or go in and say, there's definitely no right or wrong on that.
Okay. And when you walk into a music store and you look at the shelves of rosin, you'll notice there's specific bass rosin for these bows. What's the difference between bass rosin and violin rosin?
bass rosin is really sticky. There's this old tale that may or may not be true of somebody, a bass player, who left their bass rosin on the dashboard of the car, and somehow it got turned over, and they came out and got back into the car, and the rosin had vanished, and their car stereo never worked again. And that could be a true story, because if you take bass rosin, especially the really sticky brands, and you just put it on the counter, even in like a normal day, you might find it turning into this rosin pancake. It might just like ooze all over the place. You need sticky rosin for, if you just look at the size of these bass strings, they're bridge cables, really. And that powdery rosin that's so great for violin, viola, cello, that just gets that string spinning, that just doesn't really work so well for bass players. It can kind of work, sort of, but it really is suboptimal. And actually, your bass players might end up developing all sorts of weird habits and trying to force the sound if you use rosin that's too powdery. So sticky rosin is good. The other thing that you'll find a lot with bass rosin is bass rosin dries out, in my experience, a lot faster than violin, viola, or cello rosin. So if your bass rosin starts to look powdery, and by that I mean if it starts to look like violin, viola, or cello rosin, it's time to get some new bass rosin. That is the cheapest upgrade you can possibly do to your bass player or your bass section, is get them a new cake of rosin. I usually, at a minimum once a year, but even more frequently than that. Even with students at the high school level that I taught at, I tried to get new rosin out at least once a semester, and it makes a huge difference. And you really want to train students to put the rosin back in the case and close the case, just so that it's not exposed to the air and either turns into a pancake like I described, or just dries out. That will help to preserve the rosin.
Okay. Here's a basic question. What is it made of?
It's tree sap. It's some sort of mix of tree sap and I believe wax, or some sort of wax material. If I remember not exactly. If you think about baseball players, they also use rosin, they're to help with friction. And that's what it does. It adds friction to the bow hair.
Okay.
And so that's what allows that horsehair on string instrument bows to get the string spinning. You need a little bit of rosin just to create that friction. And the bigger the string, the thicker the string, the stickier the rosin. Some cellists like to experiment with bass rosin. It's not unheard of. Or use a bit stickier rosin at least. So the lower pitched instrument you have, the stickier the rosin you need. And so bass, it's just in a category all its own, just because the strings are so thick.
Yeah. Okay. Are there a couple of, favorite brands that you would recommend?
Sure. Pops bass rosin out of Houston, Texas. Pops is awesome. It's funny. You go, a lot of because you see Pops in so many places, a lot of people think, oh, I want to upgrade my rosin. Well, but then you go see the Houston Symphony play or the Chicago Symphony or the LA Phil, and you're seeing Pops bass rosin on stage. So that's a great one. There are a lot of really good companies. There are a lot of there's Pops, which is this sort of amber colored rosin, translucent sort of rosin, and then you'll find these darker looking rosins. We call them Swedish rosins, and they may or may not be from Sweden. Some brands are, but there's Carlson and Nyman's, and these are all the rosin is much darker. It's like a dark brown, almost black, and they are all sticky, but kind of have a different feel and even a different sound to them. The great thing about Pops is that because it's made in Houston, it's easy to get a fresh cake. The Swedish rosins, you can also get a fresh cake, but every once in a while you'll order it and it looks like maybe it was sitting on the shelf a little too long. But I've used Carlson, I've used Nyman's, I've used Colstein makes great rosin. And then, as with everything in the bass world, there always seems to be a new brand of rosin every year, and it's got some new formula.
I like to talk about strings. There's not just one brand out there. And what do you think about strings for different uses?
Yeah, I mean, there is an upgrade that makes a big difference that doesn't, bass strings are not cheap just because they're so big, but that's one of the best ways to upgrade the sound of the bass and the player experience, because as you start to get into those nicer strings, they just are more comfortable under the fingers, they're easier to bow. If you have a bass and it's really just going to be used in jazz band, Tomastic Spiracores are the classic jazz string, and other brands make a similar type of string. D'Addario uses Zyx strings. Those are great for jazz. And Parastro makes this great string called Perpetual. So all the major string brands have something that kind of fits that jazz category. If that is the majority of the playing that bass is going to be doing, those strings are awesome because they'll ring. They get that growl, which is the sound. It's kind of hard to describe, but you know it if you hear like a really excellent jazz line. A lot of that is just this ringing quality of the strings. Now, for me, most of the time, I would have basses that needed to play jazz sometimes, but I needed them to sound good under the bow. So then you're looking at something that does both well. And that, for me, again, all the string brands make something in that category. I'm a big fan of D'Addario. The Helicors are great, and they have different gradations. They have Helicor Jazz. They have Helicor Hybrid, which are great if you're doing some jazz playing. They have Helicor Orchestra, and then I'm a big fan of the Kaplans, which are kind of I think of as their premium orchestral string. Then also they work well for pizzicato. They sound good. The other string brands, Bel Cantos from Tomastic, are a wonderful bowed string for orchestra. Not quite as good for jazz, in my opinion. And then Parastro makes a lot of strings that fit that bill. They're Flexicor Deluxe and that sort of thing. So for me, one of these more, I think of them as modern offerings from the string companies. That would be Bel Canto from Tomastic. That'd be Kaplan or possibly Helicor from D'Addario, or Flexicor Deluxe, I think, is great from Parastro. They have a little bit of a brighter sound, which actually makes the bass end up sounding a little bit clearer. You can bow fairly easily. You can bow quickly fairly easily. That's one of the big differences between jazz strings and orchestral strings is the ability to move the bow back and forth and have the string respond. Those strings are great middle of the road strings for me.
There are a lot of strings out there.
There are a lot of strings, and it's a financial investment to start playing around because the D'Addario from the United States tends to be the cheapest here just because they're from the United States, but they're still expensive, and you get into the German brands and you're spending several $100s to experiment. So it's kind of a big financial layout. But boy, you hear the difference by taking a bass with less quality strings on and putting on one of those all those strings I rattled off are the strings that you'll see in any major symphony orchestra. So those have a dramatic impact on the way it sounds and the way it plays.
At kind of the school level, for junior highs, high schools, what's your go-to again? Can you kind of summarize that?
Oh, sure. Preludes are great. From D'Addario, preludes are kind of your basic string, and those work well. If you're playing on a laminate bass and you've got some preludes on, you're in good shape. If you want to upgrade, if you want the next step, I would recommend looking at D'Addario Helicors. Just the medium gauge Helicor orchestral, I think, are an awesome string. They sound clean and clear, and they really sort of, some strings is such a complex, I could talk about it for hours, so I'll try not to, but certain strings can kind of color the sound. It's almost like putting a filter on a camera. And something that I enjoy about the Helicors is they really tend to not do that. They tend to like let the bass sound, all string instruments, but I'm just thinking about bass right now. They let the bass kind of sound like the natural sound of that bass. But sometimes you want to play around and put a filter on your instrument. But I think I think that's probably best saved for once we get into the fully car range of instruments. So you got preludes, you're gonna be fine. That's probably what came on the instrument. If you want to step up to the next level, even on a half size bass or something at the junior high, middle school level, go for Helicor original medium gauge. You're gonna notice a difference, and you're gonna notice a difference in your players because they're going to be easier to play, and that's a good thing in my book.
Okay. So the last thing is the extension. Can you talk about what the purpose is of the extension? And we have a pretty cool one. I'd love to have you kind of go through.
Yeah, we have the LA Bassworks C extension. Lisa Gass from LA Bassworks helped us design this extension, and it's the extension is this device that is over, I guess it might be the word, the scroll of the instrument. It's like a little fingerboard that extends beyond the nut over the scroll of the bass. And what that does is it lets a 4-string bass play down to a low C. So your normal low note is an E, just like a bass guitar, or think of the violin strings reversed. The violin top string is the bass bottom string. And so you have, in the case of our extension, you have a little guitar style capo of sorts that closes on each half step. So you go from E all the way down to a low C. Why, you might ask? Well, bass has been written down to a low C for generations, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But if you're playing standard orchestral literature, those notes are in the part, and if you go see any major symphony orchestra or regional orchestra, even, or amateur orchestra, you're going to see extensions of some sort, frequently ones that look just like ours, in those orchestras, because those are the notes in the part. And once you try an extension, you realize why you want those low notes. It is a cool experience to play that low C and just feel the whole bass rumble. And one of the other kind of side benefits of having that is you can set any of those closers to be on any one of those pitches. So your E string can all of a sudden become an E flat string, or a D string, or a D flat string, or open C. Okay, so now we've taken a stringed instrument, which tends to thrive in the sharp keys and maybe not so much in the flat keys. You take and you change that E string to an E flat string, and you go into jazz band and you're playing some B flat blues or something like that. All of a sudden your bass opens up. Now you're in B flat. You've got the third with the G. You got the E flat down there. You're able to go to the 4 chord and go down to that low note. You've got all sorts of resonant possibilities. So it's kind of a side benefit, but it really does make a difference, being able to set that and get a little extra resonance in some keys that are frequently used in jazz. All of a sudden, it's great.
I never thought of that. I always thought of the extension as a classical orchestral thing, but I never thought about it in jazz. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it is predominantly found in orchestras, although you do see many jazz players play it, and it's a cool thing to have that extra range. And even just setting it to a D, all of a sudden you've got this great extra like low D string opening up the bass. And yeah, it is the sort of thing that even if you just have one in your orchestra, the sound changes. I only had one at one of my high school teaching jobs I had, but I could hear back on the recording that one player playing those low notes. It just changed the sound of the entire orchestra.
So you do see it in schools.
You do see it in schools. It's a great thing for schools. I think everybody would ideally want at least one of those for all the reasons I just described, or one on every bass. That'd be a dream. But yeah, it's common in schools, particularly schools that are playing that advanced repertoire. If you're playing Beethoven symphonies, or you're playing Tchaikovsky symphonies, you're playing grade 5 literature with your top group, or grade 6 even. If you're the type of school that's going to your state convention, or is competitive at some level, or possibly even going to Midwest or something like that, you're going to see those, because they bring more authenticity to that orchestral repertoire, and boy, are they fun to play.
All right. So one topic that I think we should touch on is the fact that the bass is one of the most commonly picked up and brought to a repair shop instruments that ed reps pick up. And we talked to Ralph Akala of Eastman about why this happens and things like that. But I'd like to hear your perspective as a bass player. What kind of issues have you had with your basses, and personally and in your classroom and when you were a teacher? And what are some things that you can do to minimize the trips to the repair shop for your bass section?
Yeah, it's incredibly common. It's a tough one too, because a lot of the reasons for things happening might be things that the orchestra director or band director or whoever doesn't have the most control over. So what you really want, and Ralph, I'm sure, will speak in great detail on this, but what you want is consistency, if possible. A lot of the problems happen from going from a really humid space to a really dry space, or a really hot space to a really cold space. A lot of those changes in consistency can cause anything from seams to open up, which is annoying but relatively minor. It just means you lose your bass while it goes to the shop to get fixed, or something more major like cracking or even warping in extreme circumstances. So I had the world's worst humidity situation at one of the schools I taught at. There was this problem with we had a cello bass room, and there was a problem with the humidification system, which if the power ever went off in the building, this humidifier would just start dumping water out of it on the floor.
That's not good.
Right. And the school had a disturbingly large number of power outages, it seemed, because I would come back Monday morning from the weekend and there'd be like an inch and a half of water in the cello bass room. Yeah. And this would happen in the winter. Okay. So now I have almost 100% humidity, and then I take it out, and this is Chicago in January. I take it out into a room that has almost 0% humidity. And if it had remained in 100% humidity, or if it had just spent the whole time in that super low humidity, it would have been in much better shape than going back and forth like that, and just the inconsistency. So it's funny, I had all kinds of problems with those instruments. Not the fault of the instruments. It's just nothing can hold up to that. At that same time, I had 4 basses that I was just storing in the band room. And they were even right next to the exterior door that people would come in and out of. But because they were not in that wild, crazy, extreme humidity, they didn't have any problems. I don't even know if I had open seams. So if you had to pick something consistent and you'll be lucky. And because there's so much more variation with the basses, getting them checked out when the weather changes, particularly when you start to get into the season where the heat goes on all the time, you're going to save a lot of trips to the repair shop if you get those instruments looked at. Because what happens is basses need, in any sort of climate with a substantial winter, they need a winter post put in. And even if it's the Mid-South or something like that, where you don't really have that extreme of a winter, the bass is just so big that it does tend to pull in on itself in the winter and expand in the summer. And when it starts to shrink in the winter, that's where the damage can happen. Because if you ever notice it's December, or certainly in January, that's a really common time, all of a sudden all the basses are popping their seams. Well, that's because the sound post has become so tight that from the bass pulling in, that the instrument has to relieve the tension somewhere. And you want to be glad that it opened the seam, because it's going to let that tension go. And it's either going to be an open seam, or it's going to be a big old crack down the middle of the top, likely. And so you want to get out ahead of that. So a lot of the things that, if you can find a way to have a reasonably, I mean, in an ideal world, let's keep those instruments in 30 to 50% humidity at all times, and keep the temperature never one that a human wouldn't want to be in. So you don't want it to be 90 and you don't want it to be 20. Now, that can be a hard thing to manage with a district, and maybe they turn off the air conditioning for a certain time in the summer or this or that. So if you can get it as consistent as you can, that's really important. And then also get out ahead of the cold season. Get it looked at, get that post refitted, or get a winter post put in, or just have someone do a once over on it. And that will prevent a lot of problems. It will prevent problems for cello as well, but it's just so much more radical on bass that's if you got to send something in, that's what you'd want to send in right around that time when the heat's going on all the time.
All right. What were some of the most common issues you saw in the classroom when it came to repairs that were needed in the basses?
Open seams by far.
Yeah.
Open seams, and then if I would have problems with older basses with the bridges warping, and it wasn't necessarily the fault of the bridge. It was more that if the bridge gets knocked out of alignment a little bit, if it goes just a little bit, leaning toward the fingerboard or even leaning toward the tailpiece, those strings exert such pressure that over time that bridge will start to warp. It's just going to happen. And so that is a setup thing that I saw a lot. And so just kind of doing, if you're a teacher, just training yourself to do a scan, or if you have a responsible student that's like the low strings representative, having them just look over the cellos and basses, but particularly the basses, and just make sure those bridges are at a 90-degree angle to the top. That will save a lot of wear and tear. So I saw a lot of bridge issues. mainly a result of me or nobody really paying attention. And then open seams were pretty common. And then, students, basses are kind of like delicate tanks. People are moving them around. I shared at one of my jobs, I shared with the band. So there was always like stand racks and hi-hats and stuff in the bass area. And my students would just kind of like barrel blindly into these things. And so a lot of just random, unfortunate student damage. Tried to train them, but with mixed results.
So if a teacher asks an ed rep, hey, I need a bid on a bass. If you're that ed rep, what kind of questions are you going to ask the teacher to make sure that you're getting them really the right instrument for their situation?
Yeah, what does your program look like? Some of those physical setup things I think are really important for bass. I'd rather have a bass that works than a beautiful bass that I'm having to send into the shop all the time because the humidity is all over the place. What kind of material are you playing? If someone says, we're doing Tchaikovsky 5 with full orchestra. Okay, well, let's get one of these more advanced models, or even a professional model. Let's get a 605 in there, maybe one with our bass extension in there so they can play some low notes. We're using it mostly in jazz, and we take it on the road a lot to competitions. Okay, well then maybe we want to go with a 105 and get a setup that's really jazz friendly, but we can still bow a little bit on it. What do the rest of your basses look like? Is this going to fit in? Is it going to be the one nice bass that all the students fight over? What are the needs of that teacher in terms of the type of playing they do, just the physical specifics of where that bass is going to be living, and yeah, those are the main things I think.
Okay, good tips. Thank you. Jason, you are a wealth of knowledge on all things bass. I just learned so many new things, and I think everybody listening did as well. Really appreciate your time. I'm sure this is not the last time we will hear from you.
Well, it's a pleasure, Shade. I could talk about bass for forever, so I hope I didn't get too long-winded.
Well, if anybody wants to learn more, you do have 800 hours on your podcast. Is it 800 episodes?
I think we're closing in on 800. So yeah, that's a good. We'll call it 800 hours. That's a good estimate.
That's phenomenal.
It's a lot of talking.
Thanks again, Jason.
You bet, Shade. Anytime.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.